Hi everyone, thanks for watching. I'm Lauren, and in this video I'm going to be sharing with you my hints, tips and advice for making a toile when you are sewing your own clothes at home with sewing patterns. You might find that this term toile comes up from time to time. Sometimes it's called a muslin, and you might have some questions about it. Whether you are a seasoned dressmaker and you've made lots of garments before, or you're still sort of testing the water and developing your skills in your dressmaking journey. And in this video I hope to answer some of the most common questions that I get asked as the owner of Guthrie & Ganny, my own fabric shop, and in the workshops that I've taught in the past as well, just to help you give some more context around this concept of making a toile. So we're going to be covering what actually is a toile. We'll also be covering whether you should actually make one or not, what type of fabric you might use to make one, how to actually construct one and put one together, how to identify any adjustments that you might need to make on a toile when you make one, and then how to start thinking about transferring some of those adjustments onto your paper pattern. Now, that point in the process of transferring what things you might need, adjustments you might need to make to a sewing pattern in order that it fits you better, is a really big area, and I'm not going to be able to cover everything in this one video. So sort of see this as a little bit of an introduction into making a toile and being able to do something useful to that. There's a big spectrum of things that you can do to a toile, from things that are really simple and quite straightforward to things that are much more in depth and advanced. So by just sort of giving you some context to all of that, I really hope that it helps you when you face the initial question of should you even make one in the first place or not, and just gives you a bit more sort of awareness of things to consider when you're making a toile. I do have a blog post that goes alongside this video as well, so if you prefer to sort of see the kind of things that I'm talking about in written format, then you can check out that blog post as well, and it just sort of summarises some of the things that I'm going to talk about. So first of all, let's cover the basics. What actually is a toile? Basically, it is a practice version that you make of a garment in order to check the fit or to practice the skills or the techniques that are involved in making that garment. And I would say you could split up making a toile into two sort of broader categories. And you might hear these terms as well, you know, on the internet or social media or whatever, that you can have a wearable toile, or you can have like a more traditional or like a true toile. So a wearable toile is a garment that you are going to make in preparation for making the sort of final imagined intended garment. And it might be that you think you need to make some adjustments or changes to that pattern, but not to the extent that it would make the practice garment unwearable. So you would make this garment with the mindset that it might not be perfect and it might not fit absolutely perfect, but it would still be totally fine, and yeah, you could get use out of that garment. But it would give you information and you would learn from that process, so that when you make your final garment you can just improve on things a little bit. So when you make a wearable toile, you're going to be completely following the instructions that are in your pattern in terms of construction, finishing off seam allowances, doing hems, all of that sort of thing, because the final garment is something that you're going to wear. A true toile is something as a garment that you would make, again, as a practice version before you make your final intended garment, but it's purely there for you to assess the fit and try and identify changes that you might want to make to that sewing pattern, or to test out the techniques that are involved in that, in constructing that pattern as well. So once you have identified those changes that you need to make to a sewing pattern, the toile is then not needed anymore. You can just get rid of it or recycle it or keep it for reference for future. And you don't need to construct this practice toile to the same level of finish that you would if you were making a wearable toile or the final garment. So for example, you don't need to cut every single pattern piece out. You don't necessarily need to sew the seams with a normal stitch length. You might sew them with a longer stitch length because it's a bit quicker. You don't need to finish off hems or seam allowances or anything. So making a non-wearable toile, or like a more traditional true toile, can be quicker than making a wearable one because you're not having to finish off all of those elements of construction. Okay, so let's cover the question now. Should you actually make a toile in the first place? Yes or no? I'm afraid there's not a straight up answer for that. And my feeling is that it's going to be quite a personal choice for you that will be affected by lots of different factors, which I'm going to go through some of them now. There is differing opinions on this, so you will find people who say you definitely have to make a toile, and you will find other people who say, you don't need to, you can just go on and sort of work it out as you go along. So there's always going to be varying opinions on this, but my feeling is that no one situation is going to be the same as another, even for the same person. And there's just lots of things that you might want to think about and consider. So one of them might be, how much sewing skill or experience do you feel like you have when it comes to constructing a garment? And it might be that you are maybe making a shirt for the very first time and you've never done a cuff placket before, or a button band before, and you want to make a toile purely because you want to just practice sewing those types of things in the garment. So actually making a toile might not be anything about fit at all. It might be just so that you can practice the techniques and the processes that are involved in actually putting together that garment. So when you think of a toile, it doesn't necessarily have to be about fit. It could be for other reasons that you want to make it as well. The next question is quite a subjective one, and the answer that will come up will be very unique to you. And that is, how much are you going to care yourself if the final garment that you make isn't 100% perfect? Or the other factor in that might be, how precious is the fabric that you want to use for your intended final project? So what I would say here is that quite often we can put our own very high self-imposed standards on ourselves that other people are not expecting or even aware of, or aren't even on anybody else's radars. And you can have, I do it myself sometimes as well. You want to make things that are really, really good. But what I would say here is, don't be unnecessarily hard on yourself. Remember, sewing is fun, and if you're finding that it's not fun, it could be that maybe you're putting too much pressure on yourself to get things perfect. Nothing is perfect, and nobody will notice if the clothes that you make aren't perfect in your eyes. They will just be, I promise that they will just be totally amazed that you've actually made something in the first place. The question of how precious the fabric to you is, it might be that maybe somebody gifted you the fabric, or it was handed down to you from someone else, or it was like the last bit of a fabric that you could ever find, in all the shops, and you want to do something special with it. If that's the case and the fabric really is that irreplaceable, then maybe you do want to make a toile before you make the final version, if you want to sort of keep your fabric for best. Keeping fabric in itself, I would say, is a separate hobby, really, to sewing. Collecting fabric and enjoying it and having it and being able to look at it as an enjoyable hobby in itself, separate from sewing. But what I would say is that if you've been holding on to a fabric for a long time and you do really want to make something with it, you need to weigh up in your own head whether the benefits and the risks of the situation. Either you leave that bit of fabric in a cupboard where nobody can see it and nobody can enjoy it, and it's just sort of hidden away from the world, or you can make it into something that maybe it isn't totally perfect, but you get to see it more often, you get to wear it, you get to enjoy that. Other people get to see you wearing it, or maybe the person that gave you the fabric gets to see you wearing it and that you used it, and that in itself is better than it just being stuck in a cupboard. The next question might be, how much time do you actually have to spend on your hobby? And if you're short on time, making a toile can be a bit of a creative because it's not as exciting maybe as making the final garment, I would refer you to my last question and just check with yourself here that you don't have unrealistic, high self-imposed expectations of yourself. We're not going for couture sewing here. Well, you might be, in which case maybe that's a different topic of discussion, but we're going for having fun, trying out new things, learning new skills, using fun fabric, having something at the end that actually looks like a garment that you can put together. And in the worst case situation, even if that garment isn't wearable, you will still have learned lots in the process of that. And that is still a really good positive thing that you can take forward into your future projects. The next question you might consider is, how well do the clothes that you typically buy from the shops, or clothes that you have bought in the past from the shops, how well do they fit you? And if you find that quite typically you are a different size on the top compared to your waist and your hip, and dresses, for example, then it might be a sign that maybe you're going to be making some adaptations to a sewing pattern, and in which case you want to make a toile first of all. Or it might be that when you buy trousers, you always find that the thighs are quite tight, but then it's all sort of like loose and baggy around the waist. So if you're typically finding that there's common themes in the clothes that you buy or that you try on, then that can all be a sign that in the sewing patterns that you use, you might have to make some adaptations to them, and in which case potentially that might mean making a toile before you actually make your final garment. The next question is this a new to me sewing pattern company that I'm using? So all of the different independent sewing pattern companies, some of which you can see in the shelves behind me here, they all start off with their own unique block or sort of base pattern that all of the patterns get graded and drafted from, and each sewing pattern company will have a different starting point. So it can mean that your body shape or your own proportions that are you and that make you unique tend to sort of fit a bit better into one pattern company over another. I know that certainly is the case for me. There's some pattern companies where I just know that I'm probably going to have to make a few more adjustments than I do on another pattern company. And that's also quite typical, I think, when you buy clothes in the shops as well, because some shops call their sizes different things. In one shop you might be one size, in another shop you're another, or you know that the jeans in one shop fit you but they don't fit you in another shop, that sort of thing. It's the same thing in sewing pattern companies. So if you are trying a new pattern company for the first time and you are finding that your measurements are maybe spanning several sizes, then again that might be a sign that you want to try making a practice toile version first. The next question is, how fitted is the garment? And if the garment is really quite sort of fitted and sculpted to your body, then it could mean that you want to make a toile beforehand, because the fit of the pattern is going to be more, I guess, noticeable or more obvious than if you're making a garment that is very sort of loose and has a lot of positive ease. The shirt that I'm wearing just now, for example, this is the Closet Core Cali shirt. You can see that it's quite boxy and it's not really very fitted at all. So even if you were spanning a few sizes in this particular pattern, it might not actually matter, because the design and the cut of the garment is so loose anyway. Whereas if you were making a very fitted shirt that maybe had princess seams or darts at the bust and at the waist as well, then you might want to do a toile of that if you're finding that you're falling across several sizes, because it's maybe more likely that you would want to adapt the fit in that. The next question is, what type of fabric are you working with to make this project? And if you're working with stretchy jersey fabric, then the final fit of the garment is likely to probably be quite forgiving, because stretchy fabric can move around with your body. So even if you are finding that maybe you're spanning a few sizes in a pattern, or it might be that you're just merging from one size to the other, you don't necessarily have to check that with a true toile. You might just make a wearable toile first of all, and it's likely that you're still going to end up with a garment that is maybe not 100% perfect, but is totally wearable and still totally usable as a garment. Next question, which I've touched on a few times, I've mentioned already, is are you falling in between sizes on a sewing pattern? And if you haven't seen my other video already, which covers more in depth about choosing a size or picking a size from a sewing pattern, I would refer you back to watch that video as well. Just because you are falling over 2 or 3 different sizes in a sewing pattern on the on the body chart of a sewing pattern does not mean that you have to make a toile. There's lots of factors that you can consider when choosing a size, like the design of the garment, how much positive or negative ease has it got, what cup size it's drafted for, all of those things which I cover in more depth in the other video. So it's not a definite that if you're not fitting in one size you have to make a toile. It's very common that people don't fit in one size, and that doesn't mean that you have to make a toile. It can, but it doesn't have to mean that. And finally, if there's alterations that you suspect you might need to make, like if you know from looking at the body chart measurements and looking at the cup sizes of the pattern, you know that you need to make, say, a full or a small bust adjustment, but you also have to merge into a different size at the waist and the hips, and you want to shorten the body. If there's like several things that you want to do, then it might be that maybe you want to try making a toile first of all, just to check that all of those adaptations you're doing to the pattern are actually working before you make your final garment. So I would say, considering all of those questions on balance that are specific to you and the project that you're doing, should go into your reasoning and decision making when you work out whether you need to make a toile or not. And it's not always going to be the same answer for every single project. So it might be sometimes you do make a toile, but sometimes you don't. Just because you have to make it for one project doesn't mean to say you have to do it all the time. So just consider that, consider all these things on balance for each project you're making, and work out whether you think making a toile is good for you. If you're interested, I personally rarely make a toile, and I quite often fall over at least 2 sizes of a sewing pattern, sometimes 3. It depends how fitted it is at the waist, because I tend to be one size at the bust and then I'm usually like the next size up at the waist, but then I'm the size smaller than whatever my bust is for my hips. So yeah, I tend to sort of be over at least 2 or 3 sizes in a sewing pattern, but quite often the clothes that I make aren't particularly like really sculpted and fitted, so usually I just look at the finished garment measurements and think, oh, I'm sure it'll be fine, like there's enough ease in that I don't have to sort of make that alteration. Because I've also been sewing for a while, I sort of know what common adaptations I need to make. So when I make trousers, for example, I have made toiles of trousers in the past, and I know that I typically need to make a small seat adjustment, and I do that on the majority of trouser patterns that I make, and I don't necessarily toile that adaptation because I know that I've just done it several times in the past. So again, it might be that if you're still quite new in the dressmaking journey and you're still working out typically what adjustments and what tweaks work best for your body, it might be maybe that you toile more in the earlier stages until you get a bit more confident in knowing that the changes you're making to a pattern work for you. And then as time goes on, you think, okay, I don't need to do a true practice toile for this, because I know that it's probably going to be fine if I just do this adaptation, and it's worked for me in the past, so it should be fine again. I'm also not sort of unnecessarily hard on myself when I think maybe, the next time if I make it, I would maybe do this, or I would maybe do whatever, I'd make a little tweak here and there. I still like and enjoy the garment that I make, even though I know that it's not like precisely the way that I would want it, because it's just, it's not fun to have those sort of pressures and unrealistically high expectations of yourself for a fun hobby. The next question is, what type of fabric should you use to make a toile? And this is probably one of the most common questions that I get asked. And the very short answer is, it depends, I'm afraid. There's not like a straight answer. The first factor in this is whether you're making a wearable or a true toile. But ultimately, either one, whether you're making wearable or a true toile, the fabric that you use to make that toile should be as close as possible in terms of how it behaves and how it drapes and hangs in comparison to your final intended fabric. That will give you the most accurate picture of how this garment is going to turn out. Sometimes it might not be completely possible to use exactly the same type of fabric, in which case you might have to use another type of fabric along with your imagination to try and picture what this final garment is going to be like. So traditionally, toiles are made from cotton calico fabric, which is generally quite readily available. It's sort of like cheaper than other types of cotton. It's just like very plain and sort of simple fabric. Its plain nature is really easy to sort of see what's going on the garment when it's on a body, and it's quite easy to like mark on it or like draw on it or see where there's any drag lines or anything like that. The thing to bear in mind with calico fabric is that it tends to be quite stiff and quite thick. So if you're making a really sort of floaty, drapey type of garment, if you use calico to make a toile for that sort of thing, it's going to be quite hard to get an idea of how that final garment hangs and moves, because calico is so stiff, whereas your final garment is like really not stiff and the fabric's very fluid. The two are quite different. Whereas calico might be good if you are making, for example, like a coat out of kind of thicker woolen fabric, then you could use calico to do that, because calico is going to behave in a sort of similar way to kind of thicker, stiffer wool. It'll give you a good indication of how things are fitting and how you can move in the garment. The other thing that you could use is an old bed sheet. Some people use that if they've got just old scrap fabric that would otherwise just end up sort of being discarded. They're good if you're just making a toile purely to test out the techniques and construction that's involved in it, or just purely to check out the fit as well. But just always remember that key sort of principle of the best way to get an idea of how that garment is going to fit and hang and move on your body is making your toile fabric as close as possible to the final fabric. If you're making a garment out of, say, a woven viscose or a rayon or a tencel, something that's really fluid and floppy, then making a toile out of something that behaves similar to that is going to be best. So you could use a polyester to do that. Polyester is typically cheaper than a viscose or a rayon because it's man-made and it's synthetic, so it tends to be cheaper than the semi-man-made / natural fibre of viscose, rayon, tencel, that sort of category. We do sell a totally plain viscose in the shop. We've got cream and black and navy. It's generally like a sort of stock item for us, and it is very similar to any sort of like woven viscose, rayon, tencel type of fabric. That fabric can get used as a lining in lighter weights viscoses that are maybe like a little bit more transparent, or you could use it to make a toile, and the drape and movement of it's going to give you a really good idea of what the final garment will be like. If you're making jeans, then you might want to find, depending on what sort of denim you're using, it might be that you want to find a cheaper type of denim to make your practice version. The only thing that I would say about making a toile in jeans is that even if you get a fabric that is, say you're making stretch jeans and you have, your final fabric that you want to use, and you get another different type of stretch denim to make your toile, the fit can still be quite different between those two types of fabric. And I would always recommend with jeans anyway, is that you still fit as you go along, you still baste fit, and you still make adaptations. Even if you'd made a toile before, I would still recommend, when you make jeans out of your final denim, that you're still baste fitting and checking that you don't need to tweak the seam allowances anywhere as well, because every denim will behave slightly differently. Okay, let's cover how to actually construct a toile now. And this again will depend on whether you're making a true toile or a wearable toile. If you are making a true toile, and you're making something like, for example, a lined coat, you don't necessarily need to cut out all the pattern pieces in that. Just cutting out the outer shell of the coat and making that up as a true toile or like a practice version is probably going to give you enough information to work out whether that garment is actually fitting or not, or whether the size you've chosen or the, you know, any adaptations you've maybe made to the paper pattern are actually working. Again, if you're making a true toile, there's no need to finish off the seam allowances in that. And as I mentioned before as well, you can also use a longer stitch length to sew the seams. That does make it easier to unpick if you have to change any of the seam allowances, for example. And it's also a bit quicker because sewing with a longer stitch length is quicker than sewing with a regular stitch length. You also don't necessarily need to hem it, or it might be that you just want to press the hem in and maybe pin it in place just so you can get an idea of the length of the garment. But you don't have to do all of that finishing off that you would do if you were making a wearable toile, or then obviously when you make your final garment as well. Okay, let's now cover how to identify changes or adjustments that you might want to make to a sewing pattern based on the toile that you've made. And before I go into a bit more depth into this, I want to just highlight that there is such a thing as overfitting and overanalyzing the fit of garments on your body. And you need to remember that you are a 3D living, moving body, and your clothes need to be able to move with you and allow you to do the things that you want to do in comfort and ease. Depending on your posture, how you stand or how you sit can also have quite a big impact on how clothes sit on your body. So when you come to try your toile on and look at what things you might want to change or improve on, instead of just standing totally still in front of a mirror and being like, oh, there's a crease here, or there's a crease here, I would suggest you move around a little bit. Stand up, sit down, pick something up off the ground, reach up, put your bag on your shoulder if that's what you're going to do. You know, just move around like you normally would, and then try to just sort of relax and then see what the garment's doing. How is it sitting on your body? Does it feel comfortable? Is it hanging in the way that I want to? Is it allowing me to move in the ways that I want to move? Does it feel restrictive, or is it just too big and loose in different places? And are there any drag lines or crease lines anywhere? And you'll find that that phrase drag lines or pull lines or creases comes up quite a lot when you start to talk about toiles and then adaptations that you might need to make. And really they are just parts of the garment where it looks like maybe the fabric's under undue tension or pressure, or it might be that the fabric's sort of bubbling or kind of looks a little bit big. For example, in the small of the back, it might almost seem like there's just too much fabric there and it's all kind of bunching up a little bit. Or it might be maybe like from here to here, like it looks like it's really pulling, or the fabric sort of taut or on tension compared to the rest of the garment and how that's sitting. So it's really at this stage where we can split the adjustments or changes that you might want to make to a sewing pattern into more simple ones and more involved, in-depth ones, and you'll deal with them quite differently. So it might be, for example, that you feel like something is just too baggy. You make something, you try it on, and you feel like it's just too baggy at the waist, and you feel like you want to bring that in a little bit. So it might be that you then try the garment on inside out, and you look in the mirror and you pinch in your side seams to make it a little bit more fitted, and have your pins nearby and just start putting some pins in, almost like as if you're increasing the seam allowance effectively to make it more fitted. And it might be that it's only a little bit it needs taken in, or it might be a lot, and you might decide that you want to transfer that change onto your sewing pattern. So it might be that you then say, okay, I know that on my sewing pattern I want my seam allowance to come in by 1 centimetre towards the waistline, so you could draw that on. Or it might be that you think, okay, well, I know I'm going to need to take it in at the waist a little bit, but I don't necessarily need to put that onto my sewing pattern. I'll still just cut out the same size that I did before, and I'll just remember when I come to sew my final garment that I need to just take a bit of a bigger seam allowance at that part of the side seam. It could be the same thing on a pair of trousers. So you try a pair of trousers on and you feel like they're just too baggy around the hips, so you do the same thing. You pinch it in, you insert pins into the side seam to make it more fitted to the the amount that you want, and then you can measure that and again transfer that onto your paper pattern. Length is another quite simple adjustment to make. So you try something on and you see that it's either too short or too long, and then you can just stand in front of the mirror and either, if you're making something shorter, it might be that you pin it up and then check the length of that and see if you're happy with that, or if you wanted to make it longer, you would just have to use your measuring tape or another measuring device to think, okay, you know, if it was maybe like 5 centimeters longer, would I be happy with that sort of length? And then you can add that onto your pattern, either at the short and lengthen lines on the sewing pattern if it's got one, or if it was a skirt or a dress that had just like a rectangle shape for the skirt, you could just add it on to the bottom part of that as well. The neckline position is another fairly easy one to identify and change as well. So it might be that you think the neckline is too high and it's sort of sitting up here, or it's too low and actually you would want to make it a little bit higher. So on your toile, as you try it on, if you wanted to make it lower, you could just measure down from on the center front how much lower you wanted it to be, and then you could take that measurement onto your paper pattern and then take account of any seam allowance that's going to be there, whether it's bias binding or a facing maybe that's going on the neckline, and then just draw in a new curve of the neckline. What I would suggest that you're doing is, if it's a curved neckline or like a rounded neckline, is that first line that you draw coming out of the centre front fold just goes straight for maybe like half a centimetre to a centimetre before it starts curling up. If you come up too quickly from the centre front, you can end up with quite a subtle V shape rather than it being round. So the trick to getting it round is having that first little bit that comes out of the centre front at 90 degrees to it, and then it starts curving up back up to the shoulder seam. Then we move on to more involved adjustments, which, to be honest, is where the big can of worms gets opened, because there can be lots of things that you might identify when you make a toile that you think something is just not quite right here. But by pointing out some of the simple things that you might be able to identify, I wanted to just give you some context to the range of things that it might be. So more involved adjustments are very wide ranging. You can get various different shoulder adjustments that you can do, like a forward or a backward shoulder adjustment. It might be that the angle of the seam at the shoulders isn't quite right, it angles up too much or it doesn't angle enough. It might be that you've got a lot of bagging around the neckline and you need to take the neckline edge in a little bit. It could be that the bust is too tight or it's too loose. You know, I could work my way through each part of the body, and there is going to be a multitude of things that potentially could help you to get a better fit in that area. I want to refer you back to my earlier point again about overfitting, and that I would probably say there is such a thing as overfitting and analysing things too much. Just check with yourself that you're not being unduly hard on yourself, and if you're finding that hard to gauge, maybe ask someone else to look at you as you're wearing something and see if they can spot what you are spotting, because it might be that actually the natural creases or the way that a garment is hanging is just part of the style of it, or that extra fabric needs to be there in order to let you move around. For example, I mean, this shirt here has got grown on sleeves, and it does mean that there's quite a bit of extra fabric under the armhole. That's just the style of it. You know, it's a loose, baggy top. Of course there's going to be extra fabric under the armhole there, because if there wasn't, it just wouldn't look in proportion to the garment. So bear all of that in mind as well. There is also a situation that you might find where you make a toile and you find that you have to make several adjustments, and maybe like a bust adjustment or a sway back adjustment or a shoulder adjustment, and you actually have to make another toile before you make the final garment again. I know, how frustrating is that you have to sort of go through all of these stages, but again, that's going to be very unique to you and your body and the project that you're working on as well. If you were making like your own wedding dress or something, you know, maybe you would make several toiles to make sure that things were like definitely, you know, pretty perfect before you made the final thing. But, you know, if you're making like a t-shirt or something, you probably wouldn't go through that same level of detail that you would otherwise. Everybody's journey is going to be different, and try to view it as a learning opportunity. making a toile doesn't have to be a waste of time if it allows you to learn something, and you maybe have to sort of shift your mindset a little bit into just, you know, it being a step on the journey that you're making. And if you've got that creative itch to sew something and have something wearable at the end, then it might be that maybe you need to make something out of jersey garment. The fit in that's generally more forgiving, or it might be that you have like a tried and tested pattern that you know is going to work for you. And if you're wanting that hit of just like making something quite quickly and being able to wear it, you just use that tried and tested pattern. But maybe for some other projects, there's just like a little bit more steps involved in the process. There are a lot of resources out there already that will help you in making certain adjustments to your toile based on what you can see happening to the garment when you make that practice version. And I plan to help you more with that in the future with further posts, but I hope this video gives you some context into the stages of making a toile, what goes into thinking about it, and also starting to look towards making some of those adjustments on a toile and how you can ultimately get a better fit. But it is a long journey. There's lots of different parts to it and different factors to it. So you just have to keep building up your knowledge and skills, trial and error, practice, 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 and see it as something fun. So thank you so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed to my channel already, then just remember to hit subscribe so you don't miss out on my next video. And I'll see you next time. Bye.